Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Doug, and welcome back to Occasionally Philosophical. I'm here with my co host, and we're going to try to pick up where we left off last time. The last time we got together, Mark, we were talking about the Renee Good killing in Minnesota and the framing of the stories that are out there. On one side, you have this, she well, I wouldn't say deserved it, but comply or die. This mentality that when you encounter law enforcement, do what they say, exactly what they say, or, bad
That
things are going to
your
happen.
your death is justified.
And then on the other side, we were saying, well, there's another framing of the story of this American mythology of live free or die, and so these two things seem to be in conflict. On the one hand, we have the freedom to protest and our First Amendment rights. And then on the other hand, we have this law enforcement, like the respect for law enforcement stories that were conflicting. And we had kind of gotten through the framework that we're exploring,
Yeah,
like the voice of mother culture, that kind of thing, and then trying to see how these stories both fit within that and emerge from that framework. And we had gotten through we had kind of ended on that, the "Don't tread on me, give me liberty or give me death" framing, as the other side of these two debates that are taking place. Meanwhile, in between stopping that recording and saying, "Well, we have to finish up next time," Alex Preddy happened, right? So now we have 2 deaths.
yeah,
I saw the video of Alex Preddy just the same way that I saw the video of Renee Good, and the in my worldview, the video of Alex Preddy was much more damning to ICE than, say, the Renee Good video was,
right.
right?
Because at least, I mean,
And in the Renee Good video, you
you
could
could make an argument.
plausibly make a case that, well, she's in a car,
Yeah,
right? That is, it could be a
it
weapon.
could be right,
Where, this guy was standing there holding a cell phone with one hand up in the air when he got tackled. And then it turns out that he was carrying a weapon, but it also turns out that he was exercising his Second Amendment right?
right,
Because, you know, he had done all the things that the state of Minnesota said you have to do in order to carry a weapon. He went and got a license and, did the classes and et cetera, et cetera. So now we have these two competing stories, right? Floating around. And part of our or at least part of what I try to look at when I look at these things are, you know, what how do they propagate, and what channels do they propagate in? And then how you're reacting or how I'm reacting is going to be at least partially predicated on where I'm consuming my sources of news about the incident from and the conditions that bring about incidents like that. Right. So, um, our next phase of our the outline that we had prepared, because we're trying to be a little more organized
yeah, right.
rather than like our conversation that we had on the phone yesterday, where we covered about 300 miles of topics. So uh anyway, we're on the Ishmael lens, right? That voice of mother culture thing that we're trying to explore, right?
Right. So, on the one hand, you have like when like it seemed like in the past resistance is painted as reasonable, right? Because, this country, the United States, rebelled from England and formed this, there was a whole war and, and that was reasonable. Like when they paint it back at, like we, excuse me, sorry.
No, I take your
Like
time.
that's basically what we learn, right? In history
All right.
class
So
that
when
like
you were in school,
that
right?
America was like this, they were oppressing us with taxes and what have you,
Yeah.
and the rebellion was taught, as like a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah, so we had, the story that you were told in school, right, every year when you took history. It was
Yeah.
basically, the colonists came, everything was going cool, but then, they started adding all these taxes and we didn't have any representation. It was taxation without representation. Right? And so then a 33-year-old Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, and that that part of that resistance to illegitimate authority, right, is baked into the American DNA. Is am I saying your point?
Yeah, you said it a lot more eloquently than I did, but yeah, it's a
All
little
right, Mark. Well, you live and learn, right? You gotta
right.
you gotta try. So carry on with your point. So that was one side of the coin. What was the other side?
Right. Yeah. The don't tread on me, the give me liberty or give me death, all that. You're right. So,
Right.
but then, like in practice, you know, going back, this isn't like new with ICE necessarily. I mean, it is sort of new with ICE, but like, um, you also have the police too, the just local police have been enforcing these laws, and it's always been like, comply or die. It's like if you reach for anything or, it's like it's a problem, right? So, these, the so basically that I guess that's my whole point is like, you have these are the two sides of the story. It's like in reality, it's comply or die. You don't really get the benefit of the doubt, you know. It's always, the police fearing for their lives or whatever, you know.
Yeah, well, that's the frame that you get, right? So if there's a killing, by a police of a, citizen or whatever, it's always framed as, well, the police were in fear,
Right.
right? They felt threatened, and therefore that fear justifies the use of deadly force. Is that the point that you're making there?
Yeah.
All right. I'm sorry, I lost my lost my note. All right, so how does when something like this happens, Renee Good, Alex Preddy, or anybody else, fill in the blank. I mean, we've talked extensively about the unarmed blacks being killed, so we could list all their names as well as this example of an average citizen encountering, the state force, right? So when when you go out into the world and you're trying to find an explanation for this, what kind of stories do you hear? Like when you say, well, why did this happen? Right? Like how do people respond to you when you're trying to ask that question? I guess they should have known
Well,
better.
yeah, I guess it goes back to your earlier point about it depends on what side you're listening to.
Well, yeah,
It's like there's the one side that's like, oh, they should have known better. They shouldn't have gone out with a gun to a protest or, you know, whatever, right? So there's that story that's being told, and then there's also like the other, like I'm not necessarily doing anything wrong. I have my First Amendment right to protest. I also have my Second Amendment right to carry a gun. I'm not brandishing it or what have you. It's like I'm using, like these are rights as an American that I supposedly have, right?
right. So you have this right to protest, right?
Right.
First Amendment right to protest, to say what it is, to say, hey, I don't like what my government's doing, and
Right.
I'm going to hold a sign that
And
says my
I'm
government sucks,
yeah, and I'm gonna
and and we have that right that's supposedly guaranteed.
right,
Right, and we have this Second Amendment right that's supposedly guaranteed, and the way that the Second Amendment is usually presented in you know, the popular media, the stuff that we encounter almost just because we live. The Second Amendment is presented as the bulwark against an out of control government,
Right.
right? So if you have a government that is now exercising power in a way that seems to take away freedoms that are part of your internal mythology, what actions can you take if the government is justified by using deadly force against any protest against it?
Right. Yeah. Like it's like you, in theory, you on paper you have this right, but in practice you don't. It
Well, that
seems
seems
like.
to be the way it's going,
Right.
right? That seems to be the way it's going, and so part of what we at least what I hope, this framework that we're trying to assemble, to look at these things will show us, um, how that happens, you know? um, or at least a way to navigate it in a better way so that we're not throwing gas on a fire of division,
Right.
right? Because, you know, we've talked about this offline a lot. I'm tired of people of just us yelling at each other all the time and not getting anywhere.
Right.
And it's part of it, I think, is as we've been exploring, it's like, well, what story are you living in? What worldview did you acquire? How did you acquire it? Do you realize how much of that is contingent just based on the particularities of how you grew up and when you grew up, right?
Right.
And whether you had a rageaholic father or, two parents that were loving and nurturing,
Right.
all those things factor in,
Yeah.
and we're not, um, and it's not to say that any one is right or better than the other. It's just to recognize that when those conflicts happen, there's a lot of pieces that can kind of that affect it in various ways. Your own personal biography influences what you pick up and what resonates with you as far as explanations of how the world works.
Yeah.
So we have these stories, right? We have
Yeah.
the one story that we talked about, right? Which is our First Amendment, Second Amendment rights guaranteed, right? Against
Yeah.
the oppression, the American story. And then
Right.
we have the this other side, which is law and order. And we have these rules for the benefit of everybody, and you have to follow them. And if you don't, well, yeah, things are going
Yeah.
to get tough for you. But
Yeah.
that's fine. Like, threatening me with going to jail, right, is different from threatening me with the loss of my life. Right, because, like, let's say I did a crime and the penalty, as they've determined by the laws that they wrote, the penalty for that crime is 5 years in jail.
Yeah.
Okay, now let's say I take the risk, I do the crime, oh shit, I got caught, and I get convicted and I go to jail for 5 years. At least at 5 years later, I get to walk out the jail again.
Theoretically rehabilitated.
Well, theoretically rehabilitated, or at least have given the opportunity to have done some self-improvement work or whatever. So but that's different from I saw a meme, it was when I was doing, a search on this topic, that one of the memes that came up was, a cop with the shotgun aimed right at the camera, and it
Yeah.
says, "Well, if you don't wanna stand behind me and support me, you're welcome to stand in front of me."
Yeah.
Right? And I think, alright, now if that's
That's
not a memification of comply or die,
yeah.
it's like, okay, because you drive around, Mark, we all do, right? You see these little yard signs, "I support my local police."
Right.
Okay. Do you support your local police gunning down people? I would say no, right? At least I don't think so, right? So, but that particular memification of this comply or die idea is definitely contained in that thing, right? That it implies that police support includes the use of deadly force, which I disagree with. I said, I think I can support the need for police in a limited kind of way without running off and saying, "Yeah, go ahead and give them guns, and if people say no, yeah, just shoot them, just get them
Yeah,
out." They're annoying, right? They're inconvenient, right? Yeah, that's an inconvenient person, and rather than spend the money to try to rehabilitate them or anything, it's just easier to kill them and bury them, and I think that's a bad, way to go. So, how do these stories get maintained more? Right. I mean, because are there other options available for one thing? Like other
well,
ways of framing what's going on other than the stories that we're talking about?
yeah, I mean, one of the ways that I mean, I kinda touched on it a second ago as far as, like, the way the media often frames it, um, is that, officer fear. The officer was in fear of his life,
Mhm.
so he had to do it because he has to go home to his family, you know? And I'm not like, I'm not saying like I don't think that they should die, right? But like that's part of it, like, officer fear, oh, it's a split second decision. You heard
Mhm.
it with the Renee Good, oh, like, she's accelerating and yeah, I get it. It all happened in 3 seconds or 4 seconds or whatever, right? It is a split but and so, and then of course they always blame it on the person too. They're it's their fault. They shouldn't have done XYZ,
Right,
so it's
she should not have even tried to move her car at all,
right.
right?
So it's
And
like these are like the biggest things that like push the narrative forward to make people, there this is the story that's being pushed and it makes sense to people. So it's like you can kind of see how the comply or die like spreads because it's like, well, if all the news stations are saying this, that then well, that makes sense. Yeah, oh, well, they should have just done that. Then they'd be alive. And it's like, right, but then that ignores like, you know, um, it ignores like I think the underlying problem. And there's other voices out there. The other story, is
right. Well,
better training, for example.
yeah, well, we talked like a few weeks ago on the podcast, we talked about like how fear, like that culture of fear,
Yeah,
right? Like how it's manufactured all the time. And it's from the subtle fears, the little things, right, that you don't really pay any attention to, like all the pharmaceutical ads
yeah,
that come up, everywhere, right? And it's a subtle kind of fear that you may have high cholesterol, you may have this, you may have that, you may, right?
right.
This, that, and then, we talked about the if it bleeds, it leads, and that whole sensationalist, kind of attitude.
Yeah,
Now you have right now we take that and we have the media framing. So, okay, Renee Good, Alex Preddy, whatever happened, and you tune in to CNN or NBC News or ABC or whatever it is, your normal mainstream news sources, and you're getting this framing that's going to emphasize the fact that these officers, these law enforcement officers are working in high risk environments and et cetera, so that this fear thing that's already part of the background noise that you're living in now
yeah.
has a target. Oh, well, yeah, I can certainly understand that, right? And okay. And then the emphasis on things happen fast,
Hmm.
right? And then you think of, well, how, like, and how many split second decisions did you make, or how many quick decisions did you make, Mark, that when you had time to think about it, going, yeah, I should have thought about that a little bit more,
Yeah, I'm
right?
sure a lot. Yeah.
Right, so in the same way, they almost excuse the violence because it happened, like that.
Right.
I had to
Right.
make a decision quick.
Yeah.
I felt my life was in danger. I shot. Okay, yeah, all right. In hindsight, it really wasn't in danger, but you understand.
Right.
And then
Yeah.
we're, oh well, yeah, and then we can wave it off, and we can say, well, our thoughts and prayers are with Renee Good's wife and whatever family she has left,
Right.
left behind, and but we absolve the law enforcement officer within that frame, right? But what questions then when we accept that frame? And one of the reasons why I use like we this framework that I'm trying to build is sort of like a lens or a filter because it will reveal some things and obscure others,
Yeah.
right? So what gets obscured in a frame like this?
Well, better training, for example.
All right, so maybe these ICE agents aren't being trained that well.
Right. Because like you have, for example, like you were in the military, it's like you go through 6 weeks of boot camp, or was it 4 weeks of boot
8.
camp for eight total?
No, it's 8 weeks of boot camp and 8 weeks of advanced training.
Oh, so 16 weeks, right?
Mhm.
And it's like day in, day out. You live there. Like it's not like, oh, I clock in for 8 hours a day. It's like, no, I'm here. So that's what we do for our military for engaging, and you hear a lot of, I see comments online, where it's like military, supposedly military veterans, talking about how, you know, we have to really assess the threat. Like you can't just shoot like for no reason just because so it's like you have, maybe they should go through a more intensive training, I'm not necessarily saying the exact army training, but some sort of more intensive training. But like you said, that conversation, it is being had. Like people do have the conversation, but it doesn't it seems to be only that,
Well,
a
it's in a it's
conversation.
it's in a small circle of people that are already involved in, looking at the excessive force
Force of
of, policing, modern
yeah,
policing, right? So, yeah, there are people talking about it, but it's in its own little bubble. It doesn't, it doesn't emerge into many of the discussions that will happen at your place of business or at the coffee shop or at the grocery store where you hear people talking about stuff, right?
yeah,
They're not talking about, the quality of training that new ICE officers get. If they get it, I don't even know what their training is. It's not something I looked into. I probably should. I should make a note of that.
yeah,
Let me do that. ICE training. All right.
yeah,
I got a note there to look that up. Um, so we have that way, so there's that conversation that happens, but it doesn't really emerge. So we don't really know. Like a lot of people are justifying what these agents did without really, and we are admitting our own ignorance about what their training actually is. Maybe they are trained well, and maybe our perception of the event is skewed because we don't understand how they were trained, what they were trained to look for. All right. But I should think that based on what I do know about general police training, that their reactions in these situations was wrong even to that. Right.
yeah,
That's my general take. But let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Principle.
yeah. Well, I think the legality of the situation as well, like because they in theory they do have laws that they're like people pointed out, like the with the Renee Good thing, that it's like at least the police, not the ICE agents, but at least police have rules where they're not supposed to shoot at a moving vehicle.
Right.
Right. And I'm sure there's other, but these, so it's like, but these things get kind of like pushed to the back, because like you said, they were in fear. It was a split second decision. It's like, oh, well, you know,
Yeah. Well, what are the
even
legal standards that govern the use of force?
right.
Do you
You
know?
know, I know recently, they were talking about the chokehold thing. I know some of the police departments like outlawed. I think it was actually they weren't supposed to be doing it anyways, but yeah,
Yeah, well,
I
they weren't supposed to be, they were doing it, and then, people were dying and various lawsuits were being brought, but those legal standards are
right,
and again, the legal landscape, I think by design is seriously confusing for the average person, right?
right,
Because that's what enables lawyers to make as much money as they do because they write the rules that they then interpret for us, right?
yeah,
Um, but that would take me too far afield. So we have legal standards that come into play that would obscure the way the media frames either side of this, whether it's the law and order side or the comply or die side. And how about who's accountable?
Well, a lot of times, like we've been touching on it a lot, the individual is usually painted as being the one that should be held accountable for their actions, and generally speaking, the state enforcement officer
Right. It's
um,
the assumption of innocence on the
is
part of the state.
justified. He gets, maybe he might get a couple weeks off, suspension or for mental health or whatever. But it's like, they might even, sometimes if it's a really bad situation, they might even, get fired from that police office, but then they go, to a
Well, if
different.
they, yeah, I mean, we've heard stories of cops that have gotten fired from one municipality or whatever, and then sudden surface somewhere else to cause havoc somewhere else. I don't think it's common, but it does happen.
Right.
Um, so
But for the most part, yeah, the accountability lands on the individual, not the state.
yeah, for the most part, yeah, like the first thing that almost like the knee jerk reaction almost
Yeah.
seems to be not to look at possible wrongdoing on the cop, but the first thing we all do reflexively is think, well, what did the person do to cause that response?
Right. And not even necessarily what did they cause in that moment. They'll bring up the past as well. We're
But yeah,
seeing
that
that.
that was something that came up in the Alex Preddy thing, right? Because the
Right.
day that he got shot, he was just standing on the street with his cell phone filming. But apparently, like a week or so before, at another protest, he had like kicked an ICE vehicle and broke a taillight or
Yeah.
something. Like, is that the story?
Yeah. I mean, that's the story, and there's also people saying it's AI, and I'm not really like an expert on and regardless of, whether it's AI or not, it doesn't matter, and in some ways it actually could make it seem worse, in my eyes. Like it could make it seem worse because now you're like, they knew who this guy was, right? And they specifically targeted him, right? I'm not
Well, that's
saying that,
that's one framing.
right. I'm not
That's
saying that
one way
that's
to
what
frame it.
happened, but like, it's like you're bringing up these past events, right, that really are irrelevant to the situation at hand, because in that moment, that 11 days ago or 12, whatever, a week
Yeah,
ago
whatever it was.
doesn't is not relevant to this situation right now, you know, unless the
Well,
the
unless
the agent
okay.
remembers them.
Yeah, so in other words, if it here's a situation that you and the way that these things can be framed, and if you're not careful and you're a little bit too credulous, you can just fall right into it, and then suddenly
Yeah,
it becomes the truth.
right,
And that is like, let's assume that a week or 11 days or whatever it was, Alex Preddy was at another protest for ICE activity in Minneapolis. And the same ICE officer was there, and he had this confrontation, and Alex kicked the car and broke the taillight. And
right.
that officer now
Was there.
remembers, he said, I know that guy, right? So now, 11 days later or whatever, there's another operation. There's Alex again, right? and now this Ice Age is, "I remember that asshole.
Yeah, he was
He broke
causing
the
trouble.
taillight on my car. He was causing trouble last time." So
Yeah,
now he comes over, and now he spots that this time Alex has got his sidearm on, and
yeah,
he's like, "Oh, first it was kick the car, now it's like, let's shoot some Ice Ages."
right, that's yeah,
Right? Now you can craft that story,
right,
right? And if that caught with anybody online and they
yeah,
started telling it, then someone else would pick it up and they would repeat it, and next thing you know, it's truth. It's gospel truth.
yeah,
No basis in reality. Right? But that's the way that stories can go. So, one of the things that the Taker mythology, the Ishmael lens gives us is a way to say that we're really taught how to interpret events, right? Because if you just accept the default, right? And I'm not saying that like the default being like CNN, ABC, NBC, but even your own media consumption, whatever that is, however you get your news, right? Whether you're, doing one of the, what do they call those? News aggregator sites, which is supposedly filtering out for bias and stuff like that. You do however you get your news. It's still giving you a pre-baked interpretation of how you should feel about this event, right? So say, what is that thing that you see advertised all the time? Ground news, right? Which suppose, oh, well, here's how the left is presenting the story, and here's how the right, and here's the blind spot. It it's still prepackaged
it's still
for you.
framing, yeah.
It's
Here's
still
the one
framing it for
framing,
you.
here's the other framing.
Yeah, here's the left. Here's how the left is looking at this story about Minnesota and ICE, and here's how they're framing it, and here's how they're right. Now, pick your side,
Yeah,
right?
I mean, you ideally, what you would do is, like, you'd read both sides and come to your own conclusion, but, it's
I bet honestly, I yeah, in a perfect world, that's what we would do. Right. In a perfect world, I would sit there and I go, "Oh, this happened in Minnesota. Okay." And I go to my ground news or whatever it is, and I say, "Okay, the left is presenting it this way. Okay. And the right is presenting it this way. And here's all the stuff that they're not talking about. All right. Now I have an opinion."
right,
I'm still operating in an environment where everything that I've considered was pre-selected and fed to me.
right,
I don't know how to go about, or I'm offloading my own ability to make sense of the world to somebody else who's offering to make sense of it for me, right? So, all
yeah, and
right.
if we were as, logical and rational as we like to think we are, then, Edward Bernays wouldn't have, you know, been the father of, like, that
Public relations, yeah.
the reason why it became it's because it works, regardless of how rational you like to think you are, we all, have
We're all being led around in one way or another by the information that's presented to us, which then ties into your recent reading of Chomsky and manufacturing consent.
right.
Right? Well, because now you've got the box, right? All these
Yeah,
opinions are available inside the box, but you never think to look on the other side of the fence to see if there's maybe another way of looking at that stuff that
right.
hasn't been offered to you previously.
Yeah,
So that's the part that's missing, right? We don't get, or the average person lacks the ability to question the legitimacy of the authority itself.
yeah.
Right? Who gave you the right to kill me? Exactly.
Yeah, what
Where did that come from? But once you're inside the box of the acceptable opinions, it's yes, the state has the right to kill you under what conditions?
right. Yeah.
Never
Instead
once questions whether you should live in a state that has the right to kill you.
kill you, right.
It's just, okay, here's the box. The state has the right to kill you under what conditions? And then we
Right.
argue about that.
Right. I mean, that's the argument, you have the death penalty as well. Like that's
Mhm.
acceptable, right? In a lot of states,
Yeah.
you know. So,
So, under what conditions is it acceptable to
right.
put someone to death? Rather than and now, but you raised that's a good point because that is one of the debates where the question of, does the state have the right to kill anyone?
Yeah, and speaking
Anyone.
right, and even when you speaking of the story and just being like inside the story, it's like I've heard it say, police officers, ICE agents aren't judge, jury, and executioner. Right. So that's even just in that statement, like being an executioner is fine. It's just that's just not your job. Like we're
Yeah.
still accepting the fact that it's okay for the state
Well,
to
we have
kill.
we have a job classification called executioner,
Right. Yeah, that's not your
right?
job.
Well, in my ever so twisted little head, that I live in a society that has a job
That's an
of
execution.
executioner is a problem for me.
Right.
Right? No, I don't think that a well-ordered society should have a job description that says executioner. We need you to kill people that we don't approve of.
Decides who approves of what.
Yeah, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So is this a new I mean, is this thing with ICE, is it new or is it something else?
Yeah, I think that's kind of kind of the elephant in the room, so to speak, is that this is America, like, for most Black Americans, that this has been America. The we mentioned it.
You mean like poor white guys like us going lamenting on what America has America come to this
Right, yeah.
where American citizens are being killed in the streets? I am rending my garments.
Yeah, it's like, "Oh my
This is
god,
not
how this is
America.
not the America I grew up in."
Well, Mark, this is not the America I grew up in.
Yeah, so
You
it's
have a
like
different opinion on that, don't you?
right.
Why don't you share that?
Well, this is the America that I grew up in, because like, for example, when I was, what, 11 years old or 12 years old, Rodney King, that wasn't an execution, but it was still like, oh, and then since the cell phones, since we've had cameras in our pockets, I mean, there's been, we could be here for a long time listing all of the, public executions that have been on camera that we've, through body camera, and all that stuff. So it's like, this has been
Well,
happening, but now that
no, wait, what's different? What do you mean all these executions, body cameras and stuff? What are you talking about?
I'm talking about Black Americans.
Oh! Oh,
Yeah.
those people.
Right.
You see yeah, I'm playing with you, Mark,
Yeah.
you
No,
know
I know. I know. But
that.
it's like, well, it reminds me. It's kind of there. I was watching this show, The Gilded Age, recently, and there was this scene, where it's set in the 1880s. So it's there's a white
Well,
character.
the age of the robber barons,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So, but there's a scene with a black character and a white character, and like basically, the white character is all shocked, that the I think it was the carriage wouldn't take her or whatever. Oh, I'm not gonna take that colored in my carriage or whatever. And it was like, and she's all shocked, and the black woman looks at her and she's like, welcome to America. This is my America. There's always been two Americas, you know. There's been the America for us, white people, and especially white males, you know.
Mhm. The America for everybody else.
Yeah, because
And
you even in the Gilded Age, like speaking of just being white males, it's like they touch on the woman's the suffrage movement and stuff, So even in the beginning, like women weren't even. Like I think what's her name, Christine Webb says it. If you surprisingly or not, there was a time when they were like, "Are women human?"
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That was actually a funny story. I didn't realize that that question had actually been I knew that, historically in the, Western patriarchy and everything, women have been, relegated to second-class citizens, but
Right.
I was unaware of the fact that there was a point in history where that was a live question, you know?
Yeah. So basically, like the whole comply or die story, has been part of, Black Americans' lives forever. The and liberty, has always been selective. I think I mean that was part of the things a lot of these, especially in the 60s when it was the whole civil rights movement, but even after that, a lot of these prominent, black
Well,
civil
I
rights
think
leaders.
I know you've done some reading in, like, some of the Black activists, because of your relationship and everything, but I think that if you do like, if you were to look at, say, the post-Civil War period, um, and you look at the Blacks, from the post-Civil they've all been saying, like, in one way or another.
But yeah, even back then, yeah.
So, I mean, like in the '60s, you had Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, these, voices that had wider distribution, but you go back to the 1920s, 1930s,
Even early like
W.B. Du Bois,
Yeah, Booker T. Washington.
Booker T. Washington, the Baldwin, what is it,
Oh,
James
James
Baldwin?
Baldwin. Yeah, I mean he's a little yeah, he was a little later than
He was like 40s and 50s and stuff,
yeah,
but I think, but again, long before that, you still had these voices that were saying, "Hey, America, story of America, this, my experience, this,
is this.
gap,
Right, yeah.
big gap."
Big gap, right.
And so for the Black Americans, the compliance story has always existed. Right? It's never been like freedom the way that you or I take it for granted being white men in this
Right.
society, right? That's not a reality for them. Never has been,
Yeah.
historically. So when so here's a conversation at work, right? It's, everybody's at work. There's like four white people and four black people, sitting there. And the four white people are going, I can't believe what my country has become. And the four black people are sitting there looking at them going, are you serious? Right. And if you're trying to have that conversation, you need to be able to recognize that reality that we just talked about. Right? That, yes, you are actually coming from a different world.
Yeah, the liberty story that we talked about earlier has always been selective. I mean, people say it all the time that, they wrote all men created are created equal while owning slaves, you know. So
Mhm.
like that are
Yeah, well, that
so it's always been
yeah,
selective, yeah.
it's always been selective, and then, I mean, when you get out of the mythological history and you get into the actual historians that really do wanna tell the truth, they note all these things. They
Right.
note the fact that, as white male property owners, they wrote their constitution to favor white male property owners as the people who knew enough in order to run a
Right.
country as opposed to the farmers and that's okay, you just take care of the farm and everything, and we'll run the government, thank you very
Right.
much. Right? That kind of thing, that kind of elitism that was built into their attitudes, right? So, when we think about this, we say some of us were raised on a mythology of freedom.
Right.
You were, I was,
Yeah.
right? And your wife was also raised on a mythology of freedom, or within that context.
Right.
However, her experience prioritized what over freedom?
Survival,
Survival
compliance.
over
Yeah.
freedom,
Yeah.
right? It's like, yes, you live in a free society as long as you, young black woman, play by the rules that we give you. right? And this is the game that they have to play. So when we're having a discussion here in 2026 about what ICE is doing, creeping authoritarianism, the fears that people are that we're actually dealing with, right?
Yeah,
We have to recognize that a lot of the people that we're talking to have a different perception of how those power dynamics are changing because they've been the recipient of or the recipient of the tip of the spear a lot longer than the rest of us are starting to now see.
exactly. I yeah.
All right. So why do you think that people accept this comply narrative? I mean, even anti-government people, even people that think that the government's like a pain in the ass, taxes, they're all, but yet they still accept. Why does that?
Well, because it in a perfect world, it's predictable because like you can say, well, you hear it a lot. Well, I'm not going to be in that situation. I wouldn't. Or if they did come to me, I would just comply, right, and I would be safe because I didn't do anything wrong,
Mhm.
right. So there's a certain, we like things to be, people famously don't like change,
Yeah.
um So yeah, it's like you have this certain comfort in knowing that like, oh, well, it's not going to happen to me, but then it's like until it happens to you.
Well, yeah, I was
But
thinking more
yeah,
of like you go out into the world, right? You leave your front door, right? You go out. And now you know that there's a there's a non-zero chance that you may interact with law enforcement,
right,
right? You try not to. You try to drive at the right speed. You try not to run red lights, and you're obviously not out there stealing things or holding people up and ripping
right,
people's purses, and pickpocketing and all that kind of stuff. So you're living a normal, average life
yeah,
with a non-zero chance of an encounter with the police. The just comply is comforting because hey, look, if I get pulled over by the cops, I just do what he says and I'll go home.
yeah. I didn't do
No problem.
anything. Right,
I and even if what he's telling me to do I don't like, I know that as long as I do it, I'll be fine,
right,
right? And so when I read about a story of a Renee Good or an Alex Preddy or a Philando Castillo or whatever, I don't put myself in that position.
right.
So I feel comfortable.
Yeah,
All I need to do is follow the instructions of the officer and I'll be safe. Now, now, what does that do to our perception of organizational or systemic violence or force?
I guess we accept it, right? I mean,
Seems that way, right? It becomes a personal failure, doesn't it?
right.
Right? It's not that the system is bad.
It's that I didn't, or the person didn't do the right thing.
Yeah. It's not that there's a problem with the system. It's not that there's a problem with ICE patrolling the streets and yanking people off and all of that stuff. That's not the problem. The problem is you. You you didn't you didn't follow the rules,
Right.
right? And so it almost eliminates the ability to even criticize the system. You may be wrong. I mean, the system may in fact be exactly what's needed to
Yeah.
preserve order or whatever, right? But you can't even criticize it from that, in that frame, right? And that's kind of what we're at least what I want to bring up, you know, is if you're talking with someone who won't even acknowledge the fact that the system isn't implicated, It's not just personal responsibility.
Right.
It's this intersection between how the system is constructed, which, while championing this idea of personal freedom and all that kind of stuff, really works against it when you think about this, when you encounter any kind of governmental agent
Right.
of any kind. Then your conception of what personal freedom and your First Amendment rights and all that stuff, just forget it. And that's a criticism that needs to be made, because you can't tell people that they have certain freedoms and rights, and then when they go to exercise those rights, get a bullet between the eyes.
Right.
you know and then the people that are watching that happen need to be able to reconcile how these two things can be true at the same time.
You also, yeah, I mean, I also wanted to point out you also don't have freedom, real true freedom and true rights unless everybody has them. Speaking of the two Americas, it's like I think, I believe Malcolm X said something along though. That was one of his points that he made a lot was like nobody in America is truly free until we're free, basically. Until we have the same rights as you guys do, nobody really does because at any point they can take it from you too. You're just benefiting like right now, right? Which is kind of the shocking the shocking part about the Renee Good and Alex Preddy. It's because they were white, you know.
Yeah,
So
isn't that terrible? American citizens, because that's the framing. Isn't that
right,
the framing, right? The framing on all these progressive YouTube channels or podcasts or whatever
yeah,
is that suddenly American citizens are being killed by law enforcement, and that just fries my cheese. It
right,
really does, because it's like, Tamir Rice, Philando Castillo, Breonna Taylor, and on and on. They were
on and
all
on.
American citizens,
Correct. Yeah.
born in this country, have a birth certificate. I was
Right.
born in Detroit, St. Louis, whatever
What
the hell,
right,
right?
wherever they're
They
from,
were
yeah.
American citizens, and not one progressive commentator ever said that, with the same level of of passion that they are about, um, Renee Good and Alex Preddy. Also American citizens, and that's the kind of hypocrisy that bugs me, even
Right,
amongst the progressive left,
right,
right? You wanna be progressive, then it's people,
right.
human beings, not just people that look and sound like you, right? The guy who doesn't speak a lick of English is just as deserving
Human.
of respect as you are, right? That guy who's cleaning out your, whatever, the guy that you hired at Home Depot, to do your yard work,
Yeah,
for $50 for the day.
right.
That guy's, deserving of respect too. Now, if he came here illegally and, whatever, and he gets identified as having come here illegally, well, yeah, send him home. Or at
And even
least
that's
at least ask him, why did he come here illegally?
yeah, I mean,
Right, and
and
try to
even
get a reason. Like, "Look, I'm gonna be thrown in prison if I stay in my country. Can I have
yeah.
asylum here?" Well,
Yeah,
all
but
right.
even that's I was just thinking even that's a story.
Even that's a story,
Like
because
that
he
people
may
how can
I
people
in
be
other words,
illegal? How
y
can a
you
human be illegal?
well, yeah, how can a human be illegal? We were created by the world, right? But let's just say that the guy, he's here illegally. He doesn't have his proper
Right,
papers,
right.
right? And he says, well, he's applying for asylum because his government wants to throw him in prison. Oh, well, you should be able to stay here. Well, maybe his government wants to throw him in prison because he's a serial killer.
Then
And there's
yeah.
a good reason why they want him in prison, right?
Right,
So we don't want him here,
right,
right? But we're bypassing all of that, right? At least that's the stories that's coming to me, right?
right.
That
That's
that
what's yeah.
through the media that I'm consuming.
Yeah.
Right. Now I recognize, like there was that story where, since we're on ice, there was the story that came up, that had everybody up in arms about some little kid. I think the kid's name was Liam something, but like the kid was like 5 years old, and ICE grabbed him and used the kid as bait to lure the father out of the house,
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I
right?
saw
And
some.
then it turns out that as you dig into that story a little more, that the father actually did everything right. He came from wherever, some South American country. He
Yeah,
showed up at the border, filled out the paperwork, and said, "I would like to seek asylum in the United States, blah, 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 blah." And I did all that, and that's all pending.
right,
And still that happened? Come on,
right,
right? And and now we're trying to live in these stories and understand, well, what is it that you believe that makes that okay?
right,
Where did you come up with that set of beliefs that says that 5-year-olds can be picked up from their preschool and then held up in front of a house saying, "If you don't want anything to happen to your kid, come on out."
right. Like, what? Like, that's like it's funny because, like,
That's
that's the type.
cartoon shit.
Well, I was gonna say that's the type of thing that, like, the villain does in, movies and whatever,
Yeah, it's
you know?
cartoon shit. It's
Yeah,
Doctor Evil, whatever that was.
I think it was in the movie Face Off, didn't I think in Face Off, like, Nicolas Cage or John I forget, well, whatever, Face Off the movie, but that
Yeah,
yeah, I
yeah.
think he picked up the kid or something, whatever, but yeah, it's just
It's
yeah,
cartoonish,
anyways, and
you
now
know?
that's just like and like you said, who why is that acceptable, I guess, is more the question of whether or not
What
it's quote unquote
what
legal.
belief yeah, what
What
belief
belief
system
system?
do you have that you can see that and go, "Yeah, alright, I don't have a problem with that."
Yeah,
I don't know. I find that hard to wrap my head around. So we here in America, I mean, obviously this podcast goes around the world. And I always get a kick out of whenever I see a comment, like in a foreign language.
yeah.
You like, oh, cool. I have to have the AI translate it for me. And
Hopefully it's
then,
doing a good
but it's like, oh, hey, we're global, which is kind of
yeah,
cool. So as Americans, we celebrate rebellion as our story. We're rebellious. We fight against almost you fight against the man who's abusing you,
right,
right? But in our actual day-to-day life, the rules that govern us is obedient.
right,
Play by the rules. So we love liberty as our mythology, but we govern through compliance. All right, fair enough. Do you think that freedom, I mean, can the kind of freedom that matters, let's just say that, the kind of freedom that matters exists in a culture where survival depends upon submission? Yeah, it's like I keep thinking about that because you mentioned earlier about like freedom, right? The way
yeah.
that Malcolm X said freedom, that nobody's really free unless everyone's free.
Yeah, I'm not quoting that, but just generally that was the idea, just
Well,
to
yeah,
make
no,
sure.
I know. That was a book that I encountered like 40 years ago. Um, but like this idea that we want freedom, we want the kind of freedom that really matters to us,
Right.
right? And like we talked about it, like freedom to choose which high sugar cereal out of the 75 in the aisle. It's not really
Is
the kind of freedom that we're talking about.
right.
Freedom to choose amongst competing consumer goods is not the kind of freedom that's at issue that we're talking about. We're talking about the kind of freedom that says, I want to live my life this way. I want to support these virtues and these values in society. I want to, you know, live this way.
Yeah.
That freedom is restricted from us because we can't choose not to get a job. We can choose what kind of job to get, but we can't choose not to get a job to support the, you know, economy. Right. And when we're in a situation, right, where a lot of people are screaming about the overextension, the rise of authoritarianism as exemplified by these ICE killings, and like these are only the tip of the iceberg. I think that over the last year there was something like 57 or 67 people that died in ICE custody.
Yeah, no,
And so
yeah.
we're dealing with a broader issue than just these two high profile things that just happened recently. You know, so at what point and what tribunal do you go to determine when the exercise of authority has become unjust?
And there lies in, I think, the problem because it's like everybody, part of what we've been talking about is everybody has a different idea of what's justice and what's not justice.
So, well, like this is the case that the founders of this country faced,
Yeah.
right? And more or less they were wrestling with the same kinds of questions, right? When interesting thing, during one of when I was president of the philosophy club at Sac State, um, I had an event and some of the professors were there. We were having a conversation about the American Revolution, and one of the professors said, he goes, he looks at us and he goes, "Yeah, I would have been a Tory."
Yeah.
And I looked at him, I said, "Why?" He goes, "Well, I just didn't find," he goes, "I didn't find the founders I don't find the founders' arguments against the authority of the king very compelling," right? So, in other words, he was taking this approach that says, well, that there was an existing authority. It was acting more or less in accord with the way that authority had always acted. And
Yeah.
so rejecting that based on whatever whatever they were talking about just seemed like a step too far,
Yeah.
but they made the choice,
Yeah.
right? And now, all right, here we are trying to live with the consequences of that choice to say, on the one hand, you have the experience of Black Americans that are saying, well, we would like to have a bite out of that apple ourselves,
Right.
right? And then you have now the the other side of that, the white American, the white culture suddenly recognizing that what the blacks have been saying, oh my God, it's actually true.
Yeah.
Right. And they're getting their first taste of that right now. And so now it's like, well, all of these people that have assumed the authority of the United States government as being benign and just is starting to go, oh, wait a minute,
Yeah.
is it?
Right.
And now that, who do you appeal to at that particular point? And that's why being able to have conversations and set, or at least recognize that you're coming from a particular framework that you need to be able to hold loosely so that you can listen to someone else is why you and I are publishing these chats online.
But anyways, we've been going for uh,
We've done our hour.
yeah.
Cool. So, well, let's end with this one. Let's leave a question for our viewers. First of all, let's thank you all for watching, for
Yeah.
hanging out with us for an hour. We appreciate it. Please leave a like, comment, uh, click subscribe, hit the bell icon.
Yeah.
All the
All the
stuff that everybody does that I don't want to do. But hell, I'm here on YouTube, so let's
Let's
run with
do
it.
it. Yeah.
Um, but let's end with this. Where are we going to go next week, Mark? Did we pick anything, or are we just gonna wait to see what happens in the news
It'll
and run
be
with
a
that?
cliffhanger. Yeah, we'll have to
All
figure
right,
out.
it'll be a cliffhanger. We'll leave it with a cliffhanger. But to wrap up this 2 week or this 2 episode arc on the situation in Minneapolis and ICE, we'd like to ask our viewers or listeners or whatever to consider this question and give us your thoughts. Do you think that obedience is a virtue in the modern society or just a coping strategy? Give it some thought. Until next time, I'm Doug,
Work
and this has been Occasionally Philosophical.
philosophical.